Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the Murders at Karlov Manor Limited Archetype Guide here on the Daily Draft channel. This video will cover all of the limited archetypes, key cards, synergies, and more so that you can effectively prepare for your first draft of the new set when it releases on MTGA Arena on Tuesday, February the 6th. Try not to disguise your excitement as we investigate the contents of this set. Let's dive in. Before we look at our first archetype for this video, let's go over the new and returning mechanics for this set so we have an idea what we're dealing with. And we're going to dive right in with a twist on a classic limited mechanic that was universally loved the first time around, and that is Disguise. For those of you that remember Morph, that's basically all Disguise is, except this time around your face-down creature also has Ward 2. Functionally, it behaves the exact same way that Morph does. And for those of you that need a refresher, buckle in because here we go. If a card has Disguise, you may cast that card face down for 3 generic mana as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2. This mysterious creature will exist on the battlefield as a generic 2/2 creature with Ward 2 until you choose to pay its Disguise cost, then flipping it back over to its front side and becoming a different creature. This act of flipping over a Disguise card occurs at a speed faster than instant speed, which means that this action cannot be responded to and does not use the stack. Some cards will give you various effects when flipped over, hence why you might want to cast them as a mysterious creature first, or sometimes you might just be a bit mana or color screwed and just need a body on the battlefield. Either way, Disguise is sure to smooth out Karlov Manor limited play experience. If we take a look at Granite Witness here, this card can be cast as either a 4-mana 3/2 creature with Flying and Vigilance, or it can be cast for 3 generic mana as a colorless 2/2 creature with Ward 2. If you chose the second option, at any point, you can pay 2 Azorius Hybrid mana to flip it over to its front side and tap or untap target creature when you do. The next mechanic is yet another twist on an old mechanic, and that is Cloak. For those of you that have ever played with Manifest, this is functionally the same mechanic, except your manifested card now also has Ward 2. For those of you that haven't, if you are instructed to cloak a card, you put that card onto the battlefield face down and it becomes a 2/2 colorless creature with Ward 2, the exact same result as disguising a card. The difference arises when you attempt to flip that card back over to its front side. In order to do so for a cloaked card, you must pay the mana cost of the card to flip it back to its front side. From what I understand, according to Wizards' official statement on Cloak, you may only do this if the front side of the card is a creature. If you have cloaked a non-creature card, you will be unable to flip it back over to its front side by paying its mana cost. If you happen to cloak a creature card with Disguise, you will have the option to flip that card over to its front side using either its Disguise cost or its mana cost. If you have a Vannifar, Evolved Enigma on the battlefield, and enter combat, the first ability requires you to cloak a card onto the battlefield from your hand. Now you have another 2/2 creature with Ward 2, but at the expense of a card in your hand, of course. Be careful what you choose to cloak if you ever want access to its front side again. Our next new mechanic is much simpler in comparison to the previous two, and that is Suspect. If a creature becomes suspected, it gains menace and cannot block for as long as it remains suspected. Once it becomes suspected, it remains suspected until it leaves the battlefield, or another effect causes it to no longer be suspected. Presumed Dead is a variation on a combat trick we've seen many times that returns a creature back to the battlefield suspected after it dies. Our next new mechanic has to do with collecting evidence. The new keyword action Collect Evidence always appears with a number. Collecting evidence is a cost that you may be asked to pay in a variety of contexts. It can be part of an activation cost of an ability or an additional cost of casting a spell. Each time you collect evidence, exile any number of cards from your graveyard with total mana value of the indicated number or greater. For example, to collect evidence 6, you could exile a single card with mana value 6 from your graveyard, or any combination of cards with mana value equal to or greater than 6. Vitu-Ghazi Inspector here lets you collect evidence 6 as you cast it if you would like. If you choose to, It allows you to put a counter on a creature you control and gain 2 life as it enters. Our last new mechanic for this set is a new enchantment subtype, and that is cases. Individual cases each have 3 abilities. The top ability is always active. The middle ability sets out the conditions under which you can solve the case. At the beginning of your end step, if the case is unsolved and you've met the condition described in the middle ability, the case becomes solved. The condition must be true both as your end step begins and as the solve ability tries to resolve. Once a case is solved, the last ability becomes active. This ability could be an activated ability that you now have the ability to activate, it could be a trigger that goes on the stack, or it could be another static ability that now functions. In the case of the Burning Masks, when this enchantment enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to a creature. At your end step, if 3 or more sources you controlled dealt damage this turn, you solve the case, which allows you to sacrifice this case to impulse draw 3 cards from the top of your library, choose one, and gives you the ability to play that card this turn. Our main returning mechanic for this set is a small mechanic that is basically evergreen at this point, and that is Investigate. When you investigate, a colorless clue token is created that has the ability to be sacrificed for 2 generic mana to draw a card. Simple as that. One final quick note about a recent announcement by Wizards regarding booster packs. You may have seen that beginning with Murders at Karlov Manor, draft boosters are no more and are exclusively replaced with play boosters. If you're looking for a breakdown of what will be contained within a play booster, tune back into the channel on Monday and check out my pre-release guide where I will go into the details of the changes that are coming to the limited experience. Alright, with that look at the mechanics out of the way, let's take a look at the first archetype for today's video. But before we do, we've got a quick message from me. Thanks me. Set review season is the perfect time to consider supporting the channel via Patreon. We have several tiers over at the Daily Draft Patreon with rewards including access to my tier lists, early access to content, and lifetime access to the Daily Drafters Discord server. I'm incredibly proud of my continued work on my tier lists, and here's an example of what these tier lists look like for the last set, Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And as you'll see, I use a traditional A through F rating for every single card. I let you know if the card has moved up or down since my last update, and I give you the ability to hover over each individual card for a picture and a clickable link to Scryfall. You'll also get access to my common rankings, my uncommon rankings, and my removal rankings, where I rank every single common, uncommon, and removal spell in the entire format for you. I'm currently working on my Murders at Karlov Manor list, and will have this released to patrons in the Centaur Courser rewards tier as soon as I'm finished, guaranteed before pre-release weekend. If $5 is a bit too rich for your blood, we have $3 and $1 tiers that come with early access to content and lifetime access to the Discord server, a great place to hang out and discuss all the happenings of the brand new set. And if a monetary contribution isn't your speed, a subscription to the channel is always enough. And now, back to the set review content. With all that out of the way, let's dive into the main event in today's video, the Archetype Guides. I'll now go ahead and run through all 10 color pairs that exist in Murders at Karlov Manor, what the decks care about, their themes, some of the key commons and uncommons for the archetype, and even some rares and mythics that can pull you into the deck as well, and we will begin with Red-White, which is yet again a classic aggro deck, but this time cares about attacking with 3 or more creatures. Red-White gets to be aggressive in almost every set, so let's hope the payoffs can provide a fun enough of a twist. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Meddling Youths, which lays it out pretty simply. It's a 5-mana 4/5 with haste that also gives you clues every time you attack with 3 or more creatures. Now, what good would an aggro deck be without at least a few aggressive creatures? And some of the ones you can find in these colors at common and uncommon include Inside Source, which is a 3-mana 1/1 that also comes with a 2/2 and an aggressive ability. Person of Interest is yet another creature that comes with 2 bodies attached to 1 card. Frantic Scapegoat is a 1-mana 1/1 with haste that can also suspect itself and even pass off a suspect to another creature if you want. And Dogwalker is a 2-mana 3/1 with Vigilance that also has Disguise that can give you 2 more 1/1 creatures if you elect to cast it for its face down cost first. What are some of the good payoffs for doing all of this attacking? Felonious Rage buffs the power of a creature at instant speed and also gives you a 2/2 when that creature dies. On the Job gives your whole team +2/+1 at instant speed. Karlov Watchdog gives your whole team +1/+1 when you attack with 3 or more creatures. Case of the Gateway Express is a removal spell that can eventually turn into a mini anthem for your whole team. And Seasoned Consultant is a 2 mana 1/3 that can attack as a 3/3 if you attack with 3 or more creatures in total. Some of the rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Warleader's Call, which is just Glorious Anthem with the upside of continuously dealing additional damage to your opponent all by itself. Aurelia, the Law Above, is an enormous flying hasty threat that draws you extra cards and can drain your opponents if players attack with tons of creatures. And Connecting the Dots allows you to store up exiled cards whenever you attack and eventually exchange your hand for all of those stored up cards you've gotten while attacking. Next up we have Blue-White, which gets a tribal theme with a twist. Blue-White cares about the detective creature type and also has a bit of a draw to sub-theme in the form of clue generation. This deck takes advantage of aggressive detectives while using clues to refill your hand into the late game. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Private Eye, which is a 3 mana 3/3 that is an anthem effect for your other detectives and also makes your detectives unblockable when you draw your second card each turn, presumably from all those clues you've been hoarding. We'll first take a look at some of the detectives and detective payoff cards for this deck, beginning with Projector Inspector, which is a 3 mana 3/2 that lets you loot whenever your detectives make an appearance on the battlefield. Exit Specialist is a 2 mana 2/1 that's hard to block that can also give you some nice tempo if you choose to flip it. Perimeter Enforcer is a 2 mana 1/1 flying lifelinker that can grow as more detectives enter the battlefield on your side. Cold Case Cracker is a flying detective that dies into a clue token. Inside Source is a creature that comes with a 2/2 detective and can pump other detectives you control. And Case of the Pilfered Proof gives your detectives additional counters and eventually creates additional clues for you for free. When it comes to a few ways to make clues in these colors, we've got Novice Inspector, which is essentially just a reprint of Thraben Inspector, but now it's a detective, so it's got even more synergy with this set. Curious Inquiry pumps your creature and also gives you clues when that creature connects with your opponent. And Case of the Filched Falcon gives you a clue on ETB and eventually lets you turn itself into a 4/4 flyer. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Officious Interrogation, which can give you an incredible amount of clue tokens for the low cost of just 2 or maybe 4 mana. Alquist Proft Master Sleuth gives you a clue when he enters and can also give you even more cards and life by sacrificing clues in the late game. And Ezram Agency Chief is a 5 mana 5/5 flyer that comes with 2 clues and can gain all sorts of impressive abilities to protect itself and your life total. Next up we have Red Black, which is an aggressive deck this time around that cares about suspecting your own creatures. Remember, suspected creatures have menace and can't block, so you will definitely want to be attacking with this deck more often than not. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Runebrand Juggler, which is a 2 mana 2/2 creature that suspects a creature you control when it enters the battlefield and can even turn into a removal spell on a stick in the late game, allowing you to trade a suspected creature you control for a creature your opponent controls. Once again, you can't have an aggressive deck without aggressive creatures, so let's take a look at a few in these colors, beginning with Red Herring, which is a 2 mana 2/2 with haste that has to attack each combat, but you can cash it in for a card when that's no longer relevant for you. Person of Interest is a 4 mana 2/2 that enters suspected and also comes with another 2/2 body. Frantic Scapegoat is an aggressive little 1-drop that can assist other creatures in becoming more evasive. Night Drinker Moroi is a 4 mana 4/2 flyer that pings yourself for 3 when it enters unless you choose to disguise it first. Leering Onlooker is a 1-powered flyer that can exile itself from your graveyard to give you 2 more flying bodies. And Shady Informant is an aggressive creature that can ping down any target for 2 when it dies. Some of the suspect synergies that this archetype has access to include Repeat Offender that can continually grow and suspect itself. It doesn't add up, can reanimate a creature and suspect it in the process. Clandestine Meddler comes in and suspects a creature and can let you surveil whenever your suspected creatures attack. And Convenient Target can suspect and buff a creature and return itself from your graveyard to your hand. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Case of the Stashed Skeleton, which makes a suspected 2/1 skeleton when it enters, and can eventually become a demonic tutor if you found a way to dispose of that skeleton. Barbed Servitor is a suspected creature that can either draw you extra cards or force your opponent to lose life, neither option being particularly good for them. And Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, is a 6/6 flying trampler that forces your opponent to sacrifice permanents or have you draw cards. Next up we have Red Green, which is the first of two decks that gets to play with one of our new keywords, as this deck is a deck that cares about big disguise creatures. Spend the early game accelerating your mana and then beat down your opponent by flipping over Haymaker after Haymaker. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Tin Street Gossip, which is a 4-mana 4/4 with Vigilance that can also add 2 mana to cast face-down creatures or to turn creatures face-up. In order to be flipping over huge threats, we may need some access to some ramp cards, so let's take a look at a few beginning with They Went This Way, which lets you grab a basic from your deck and put it onto the battlefield. Flourishing Bloomkin can grab 2 forests from your deck when it flips and even put one of those right onto the battlefield. Goblin Mask Maker can make all of your face-down creatures cost less mana whenever it attacks. And Aftermath Analyst can sacrifice itself to return all land cards from your graveyard back to the battlefield. So what are some of these big threats to look out for at lower rarities? Greenbelt Radical flips into an enormous overrun effect for your entire team. Culvert Ambusher can force blocks from your opponent whenever it is turned face up. Offender at Large can give an attack bonus to a creature when it flips over. Bulrak Clan Basher can hit extra hard as a 3-powered double striker. And Rift Burst Hellion is just a big fat creature with reach that can be flipped for 6 mana. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Incinerator of the Guilty, which is a 6 mana 6/6 flying trampler that can even wipe their entire board if your graveyard is stocked up enough. Pyrotechnic Performer turns the act of flipping creatures into bite effects. And Ansrag the Quake Mole is a 4-mana 8/4 that has the ability to give you an additional combat step and even force itself to be blocked. Next up we have Black Green, which never really gets a solid theme, so let's see if collecting evidence to control the game can provide any better results. This deck uses the Collect Evidence mechanic to support a long game strategy that gives you extra value whenever a creature card leaves your graveyard. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Insidious Roots, which is a 2-mana enchantment that gives you a 0/1 plant every time one or more creature cards leaves your graveyard, and also gives your plants counters to grow them as well, a fun little build around for collecting evidence into the late game. We'll start with a few ways to collect evidence in this archetype, beginning with Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, which gives you the ability to collect evidence 6 as you cast it, and can come with a counter and some life if you do so. Bite Down on Crime is a bite spell that could cost as little as 2 mana if you chose to collect evidence as you cast it. Sample Collector can collect evidence as it attacks to give counters to creatures you control. Polygraph Orb can repeatedly collect evidence and force your opponent to lose life, discard cards, or sacrifice creatures. And Extract a Confession is an edict effect that gets better if you chose to collect evidence as you cast it. So what are some of the payoffs for collecting all of this evidence? Chalk Outline gives you a 2/2 creature and a clue every time one or more creatures leave your graveyard, which notably does occur as you collect evidence. Rot Farm Mortipede can gain menace and lifelink as creatures leave your graveyard. And Soul Enervation is a removal spell that can also drain your opponent as creature cards leave your graveyard. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Axebane Ferox, which is a hasty 4/4 that forces your opponent to jump through some hoops to target it. Deadly Cover-Up is another way to collect evidence that is a sweeper effect with upside. And Izoni, Center of the Web, has an enormous block of text that is literally all upside on a 6-mana 5/4. Next up is Green-White, which is the second deck in the format that gets to play around with Disguise, but this version is more of a go-wide deck that wants to flood the board and accrue impressive rewards as its creatures are turned face up. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Sumala Sentry, which is a 2-mana 1/3 with Reach that also distributes 1/1 counters to permanents as they get turned face up, and even gives itself a counter too, a very aggressive and rewarding benefit for flipping your mysterious creatures. We first got to check out a few ways to go wide in this archetype, beginning with a Killer Among Us, which is 5 mana for 3 creatures that can sacrifice itself for some extra value later. Case of the Trampled Garden gives a couple of counters to your team, and if your team is big enough, can continue to give more counters as you attack. Museum Nightwatch is a 3/2 creature that also dies into another 2/2 creature. Inside Source is a 3 mana 1/1 that comes with a 2/2 body, 2 bodies for 1 card. And Case of the Gateway Express kills off a creature when it enters and can eventually flip into a mini anthem for your whole team. Next, we've got to check out a few of the payoffs for flipping all of these creatures, beginning with Vengeful Creeper, which is a 5 mana 5/5 that has some artifact and enchantment hate stapled to it. Greenbelt Radical flips into an enormous overrun effect for your entire board. Flourishing Bloomkin grows with the amount of lands you control and can help you ramp if you chose to cast it face down first. And Crowd Control Warden gets bigger and bigger based on the size of your board. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Unyielding Gatekeeper that can act as a removal spell if needed whenever you decide to flip it over. Tolsimir Midnight's Light is a 5 mana 3/2 lifelinker that comes with a 5/5 trampler and has even more upside beyond just that. And Tristani 3 Whispers is a 3 mana 4/4 with 3 different abilities to distribute among your creatures as you see fit. Next up we have Blue-Green, which is yet another deck that cares about collecting evidence, but as opposed to Black-Green, Blue-Green cares more about collecting evidence to power up its spells rather than playing more towards the late game. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Evidence Examiner, which lets you collect evidence 4 at the beginning of your combat on your turn, and if you do, gives you a clue as a reward. It also rewards you with that clue anytime you collect evidence, not just when you use its own ability. We'll first take a look at some of the ways to collect evidence in these colors, beginning with Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, which can collect evidence 6 as you cast it, and come with a counter and some life if you do. Bite Down on Crime is a bite spell that can cost as little as 2 mana if you chose to collect evidence as you cast it. Sample Collector can collect evidence as it attacks to distribute counters among your creatures. Crime Stopper Sprite can collect evidence when you cast it and stun a creature if you do. And Behind the Mask can become either an animation spell to turn something on your side into a 4/3, or a quasi-removal spell by turning one of their things into a 1/1. Now there are only a couple of ways to get paid off for collecting evidence in these colors, and one of them is Chalk Outline, which can give you 2/2 bodies and a clue every time you collect evidence with a creature card, and Surveillance Monitor gives you a Flying Thopter each time you choose to collect evidence. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Intrude on the Mind, which can stock up your graveyard and give you an evasive Thopter at the same time. Cryptex is a way to repeatedly collect evidence and eventually cash it in for more cards. And Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy can ramp you, give you a clue, and end up as an evasive flyer. Next up is Blue-Black, which is a classic control deck that uses clues to accrue its card advantage. It uses defensive spells to extend the game and generate clues that turn extra mana into card advantage to control the late game. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Curious Cadaver, which is a 4 mana 3/1 flyer that can return itself from your graveyard to your hand each time you sacrifice a clue, a nice little bonus for doing what you were already planning on doing anyway. What would a good control deck be without controlling elements to control the game? So let's take a look at a few, beginning with Long Goodbye, which is an uncounterable removal spell for smaller creatures. Murder gets a reprint here at common and kills any creature for just 3 mana. And Unauthorized Exit is a 2 mana bounce spell that also surveils 1. We've also got to figure out how to accrue that card advantage in the form of clues. So let's take a look at Deduce, which is a cantrip that also gives you a clue. Out Cold stuns a couple of creatures and also gives you a clue for your troubles. Curious Inquiry can repeatedly give you clues if the creature you chose to suit up is able to deal damage to your opponent. Cold Case Cracker is a 3/3 flyer that dies into a clue token. And Persuasive Interrogators enters the battlefield with a clue and can even poison your opponent out in the late game if you're able to sacrifice enough of them. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Deadly Cover-Up, which is a nice sweeper for a control deck with a little bit of upside. Homicide Investigator can give you up to a clue per turn as your creatures trade off with your opponents, and Drag the Canal is essentially a 2-mana 2/2 with Flash that could also give you 2 life, Surveil 2, and give you a clue if a creature also died this turn. Next up is Blue-Red, and no, it isn't a classic spells deck this time around, but rather an artifact-based deck that cares about sacrificing those artifacts. It uses clues and flying thopters to accrue card advantage and deploy evasive threats to close out the game. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Gleaming Geardrake, which is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that gives you a clue when it enters, and also gets an additional counter every time you sacrifice an artifact, adding more power to your evasive army. Let's first check out a few ways to generate some of the artifacts that we will be sacrificing, beginning with Cold Case Cracker, which dies into an artifact in the form of a clue. Harried Dronesmith gives you a Thopter every single turn just by sitting on the battlefield. Detective's Satchel is an artifact itself, comes with 2 artifacts when it enters, and can tap to create even more artifacts if you've sacrificed artifacts this turn. And Gadget Technician is a 4-mana 3/2 that comes with a 1/1 flyer, both of which are artifacts. So what are some of the sacrifice synergies we can find in these colors? Let's start with Suspicious Detonation, which can be a 2-mana deal 4 if you've sacked an artifact this turn. Crime Novelist gets a counter and gives you a mana back when you sack artifacts. Reckless Detective can sacrifice artifacts himself and gives you cards back and buffs himself in the process. Furtive Courier becomes unblockable whenever you sack artifacts. Cornered Crook can sack an artifact when it enters to ping anything for 3 damage. And Benthic Criminologists can sack artifacts to give you some extra card draw. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Krenko's Buzz Crusher, which is getting a lot of buzz in constructed formats, but usually a 4-mana 4/4 flying trampler is just good enough in limited. Krenko, Baron of Tin Street, can sacrifice artifacts himself and create an army of goblins that will continue to grow out of control if not dealt with. And Forensic Gadgeteer gives you clues when you sacrifice artifacts and lets you sack those clues for just 1 mana instead of 2. Our last archetype for today's video is Black-White, which is yet another disguise deck but cares more about creatures with power 2 or less. Playing your disguised creatures as 2/2 mysterious creatures will be rewarded when in this archetype. Our signpost uncommon for this archetype is Wisp Drinker Vampire, which is a 4-mana 2/4 flyer that drains your opponent for 1 every time a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield. It also has an ability for 7 mana to give all of your small creatures Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn, an ability that is sure to turn the tides of battle. What good would a deck centered around creatures with power 2 or less be without, well, creatures with power 2 or less? So let's begin with Unscrupulous Agent, which is a 2-mana 1/1 that exiles a card from your opponent's hand when it enters. Leering Onlooker is a 1-powered flyer that can exile itself from your graveyard to give you 2 more 1-powered flyers. Novice Inspector is a 1-powered creature that comes with a clue. Inside Source is a 3-mana creature that comes with 2 bodies that have power 2 or less. And Crovad Haunch can give you 2 1-powered creatures as it puts itself into the graveyard. What are some of the payoffs for deploying all of these small creatures? Neighborhood Guardian can temporarily buff a creature when a small creature enters. Snarling Gorehound gives you a Surveil every time a small creature enters. Market Watch Phantom can gain flying as smaller creatures enter. And Hazda Vigilante can give multiple counters to smaller creatures each time it attacks. Some rares and mythics to keep an eye out for in this archetype include Assemble the Players that can give you some card advantage in the form of casting small creatures from the top of your deck once per turn. Delny Streetwise Lookout makes your smaller creatures tougher to be blocked and gives you a couple more triggers per game. And Barbed Servitor forces your opponent to decide to give you card draw or take a bunch of damage, neither of which is particularly great for them. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of this video if you're still here. I'm always excited for the release of this video because I know it will be very beneficial to have all of this information in one place so that you can have an easy way to find what you need if you wish to revisit the video throughout the week. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there's a decent chance they might as well. If you're already subscribed to the channel, thanks for being here today, and if you're not, go ahead and click that subscribe button to stay on top of set review season and have access to consistent, high-quality drafts as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you next time here at Daily Draft.